And while you do that, I'm going to read to you from Want Resilient and Well-Adjusted Kids, Let Them Play. It's by the Hechinger Report. Research shows that when mammals play, their brains are activated in a way that can change neuron connections in the prefrontal cortex, which impact emotional regulation and problem solving. Play also releases chemicals in the brain, including oxytocin, which helps regulate emotions and supports social skills, and dopamine, a neurotransmitter that impacts memory, motivation, attention, and mood. Kids are flooded a lot of times in play with these positive emotions. Play is so powerful that it's often used as a form of therapy for children who deal with anxiety or trauma. Even as children move up through the early grades, research shows play can continue to have an impact. Elementary principals have reported that recess, for example, has a positive impact on academic performance, and that students are more focused afterwards. Play is considered to be an integral to academic environment for both social, emotional, and academic development, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. Researchers have largely relied on experiments with animals to hone in on play's impact on the brain. Those animals are rats. A 2003 study of rats' brains found that rats raised in a playful, stimulating environment had higher levels of protein that grows and maintains brain cells than rats raised in solitary, boring environment. Other studies have shown that play in young rats impacts the parts of the brain associated with social interactions and thinking. Studies of children have also shown play's benefits, including improved language skills, problem-solving skills, and math skills. Certain types of imaginative play have been found to improve perseverance. Play can even be used to close achievement gaps between young children, some experts argue. To truly benefit from play, children must be given ample, unstructured playtime. That means they should receive at least an hour each day in a safe environment to create their own enjoyment, their own rules, their own experiences. This child-led free playtime can also help children internalize what they are taught about the world. Play is one of the main ways that children really consolidate their learning. The way we really make our skills permanent and enriched and highly developed is often through our play experiences.
orchestra. So I was telling my children yesterday that I stopped dressing up for Halloween by about 4th grade. There was one extra year, maybe it was like 6th grade, when a friend and I decided to go trick-or-treating on a whim, and we grabbed flannel shirts and jeans and were construction workers. But that was like an aberration. I really had stopped. And I don't know why I stopped as young as I did. I don't really like scary things, that's true, or masks, but I do really like candy, so I'm not sure why I stopped. I think I felt too grown up for it, right? It's possible it's because my older brother had stopped and I was like, well, I'm also like too cool. I don't know. Halloween can, for some folks, be an ongoing love and they never stop getting excited about dressing up. And others of us, we let it pass from our lives like so many parts of our childhood does. It has been really interesting for me watching 3 different children, and now we'll watch a 4th, growing up, watching when toys start to hold less interest, seeing when each child begins to abandon imaginative play, grasping when each one has begun to feel too cool for something or other. And maybe you have watched children go through this, or perhaps you remember your own growing up and what it felt like to move on from certain activities and certain behaviors. Each child is unique, and we as a congregation and as a society, we make decisions about how we're going to support children as they grow. I've been thinking about religious education a lot over the last few weeks, and I want to take a moment, and only if it feels safe to you to do so, I want you to think about and try to remember any religious upbringing you had. Again, only if it feels safe to. Did you go to the mosque or the church or the synagogue? Did your grown-ups teach you meditation? And I'm going to ask a few questions, and you do not have to answer, but you can answer by a show of hands if you feel comfortable. How many of you were brought to houses of worship for some sort of religious education? Okay. How many of you had some ritual that you were taught or engaged in with your family that wasn't formal religious education? How many of you had a good experience of religious education? Fewer. How many of you had a bad experience? How many of you, in the context of your religious education, felt free to become yourself? How many of you felt free to ask questions? How many of you had religious education that explicitly involved play? Okay. Unitarian Universalist religious education has a history of about 230-ish years, give or take. And I'm going to offer you a condensed summary of that evolution. And this comes largely from the book Claiming the Past, Shaping the Future, which is edited by Roberta Nelson. It's 4 essays on the different eras of religious education. Liberal religious education, to be clear. In the first, which spans from the late 18th century until about 1930, liberal congregations were offering religious education as a supplement to children's normal lives. This is where it starts. It starts with this idea that kids who were working all week needed to learn how to read and write, and that's what they were doing on Sunday at their religious education school. They were called first day schools. And they kept kids off the streets and they taught them what they weren't learning in the factories, right, or on the farms. And this led to the concept of Sunday school. And in 1810 in Beverly, Massachusetts, quote, the first known Sunday school was established solely for moral and religious instruction. Such schools became really common, although they had naysayers, and curricula started to take shape, and they were focused on the Bible and on rote memorization, right? The teaching methodology was nothing like we would recognize as progressive. They were not particularly liberal. And then came the influence of the transcendentalist movement, right, in the 1820s and the 1830s. People began to think about children and their spiritual lives and needs a little bit differently, And the influence of that transcendentalist movement was this idea that children are closer to God, that children are more holy, have a direct connection with the divine inside themselves and outside themselves. You could hear that in that first hymn we sang, right? The I seek the spirit of a child. That transcendentalist idea is right in there. And that idea becomes even more enlivened as the 19th century wears on, bringing with it this idea that children don't need to be like imprinted on. We don't need to like tell them how to feel about God and the world, but let them flourish. There's actually a reading in our hymnal by William Ellery Channing, who's one of the foremost Unitarians of the 19th century, in which he writes, quote, "The great end in religious instruction is not to stamp our minds irresistibly on the young, but to stir up their own." So this first era really begins to end as the ideas of John Dewey become more popular, privileging this idea that children are unfolding and that there's a recognizable pattern of growth that happens in human lives. The second era comes in with the dominance of these two figures whose names you may or may not have heard, Sophia Lyon-Fahs and Angus MacLean. Both were trained primarily as teachers, and from about 1930 to 1965, their ideas about intentionality, their philosophies about children's growth, and the child's experience of the world really come to dominate Unitarian and Universalist thinking. Fahs was a prolific writer, and both she and MacLean led liberal religious education into a holistic approach. Her work didn't shy away from big questions about life and death as children experience them. And yet much of the curriculum still focused on the Bible and on history. Fahs and MacLean were interested in method and in children's development and unfolding, but children's religious education still looked somewhat traditional and involved instilling into children a particular vision of belief. From 1965 to 1980, those who were forming curricula for the UUA considered burgeoning methodologies in education, including the discovery method. So this is a method involving leading children toward discovering or intuiting principles for themselves. It was eventually seen as leading for a Unitarian Universalist context. And then there was the inquiry method. And this was a method which really open-endedly invited children into question asking and allowed them to diverge from a predetermined end goal. This phase centers the child's understanding of the world and doesn't limit that world to what we want children to know of it. Children were encouraged to consider their lives and their experiences, to think about and digest and wonder and engage with the wholeness of their experience. There was a focus on ethics and the changing face of American culture and values as the 60s and the 70s moved on. There was a changing understanding of what counted as religious and what counted as secular. And there was an attempt to create curricula and teach in ways that actually met children and families where they were in that changing and tumultuous time. Finally, as cataloged in this particular book, is the fourth era, from 1980 to 1999. This era saw new curricula, new concretizing of the philosophies that had been developing from the beginning. So the idea that a children's growth is a becoming, and their religious and spiritual growth is also a becoming. The idea that the whole person exists within a multi-layered world and must be encouraged and educated as a whole person. The idea that children's religious education, as well as the ongoing lifelong education of adults, happens in all parts of the congregational experience. The idea that we humans go through stages of development and we don't ever stop developing. Nelson's edited volume ends with 1999. This past quarter century has seen unbelievable change in the landscape of religious education. There exist so many different curricula. Do you remember when Sally did that reading just before and it said that recess was really important for focus? Okay. Tom, can you help me out? Can you lift up the cloth over here? We're gonna take recess. It's not gonna be full hour, I'm sorry, I don't have a full hour to give you of recess. Ron, in a minute, can you play me just some doodly-doo recess music? Lift the cloth from down here, like down below. We're gonna have recess. there are some balloons. We're gonna play Keepy Uppy. Who knows the game Keepy Uppy? Oh, that's not gonna work, Tom. You gotta get them out there to the people. All right, Tom's gonna deliver the balloons and we can't let them drop. It's recess time, my friends. We're gonna do it for 2 or 3 minutes. We're having some playtime. All right, would you like to play Keepy Uppy? You can do it just right here for yourself. Like volleyball? Yes, no, oh, so funny. Recess is good. Recess is good. Tom! Don't let it drop. Oh, Tom! Sally! Okay. We'll do what the teachers do. 1 more minute of recess. We're releasing oxytocin. All right, friends. 1 more bounce and then hold that balloon. Okay, I promise we can play with the balloons after, too. Thank you, Ron. With all of that oxytocin and dopamine released into our brains, now we can focus ourselves again. It's the post-recess focusing. So the past quarter century, I said, it has seen a lot of change. There's lots of different curricula. We have spent time stuck a little bit in methods that have not progressed along with other progressive models. And we have started to just like throw things at the wall to see what sticks, to see if they work to provide a meaningful experience for families and children. And I will tell you honestly, I haven't actually seen all that much stick, if I'm honest. Okay, but here's the thing. I've been listening to our parents here at this congregation. I have been listening to the parents I know that I talk to when my minister hat is off and my mom hat is on. And I've been watching my own children. And ultimately, I actually care a lot less about trying to describe what's happened in the last 25 years. And I care a lot more about thinking about what the next 25 years are going to look like when it comes to children's religious education, but also when it comes to providing for whole families and providing for all of us into the future. And today, what I want to suggest, based on my observations and on my listening, is that the next 25 years are crying out desperately for us to ground ourselves in play. In a world that is filled with anxiety, in childhoods that are overscheduled and overstructured, and I am as guilty of doing this as anyone, in a world where we tend to like go and go and go and do and do and do, and hopefully one day, if we're lucky, we get to retire and maybe then we can relax and do what we please. All of us need protected spaces and times for play. Many years ago, not long after my twins were born, when I was a single mom, I remember reading a study that said that one of the best ways for single moms to de-stress, to be able to be more present, was actually to schedule time each day to play with their children. That research showed that even when you think you have no time, even when you think it's going to make you feel more stressed, making time to play is actually what helps. And if congregations are going to continue to be places that attend to the whole person, to the holistic needs of individuals and communities, that teach folks how to be in relationship and have healthy boundaries, then we, congregations, are going to have to be places that allow play, encourage play, and engage in play, not just with the children, but with all of us. And play in this case doesn't mean one thing only. It doesn't just mean team sports that allow for the release of aggression in healthy ways. It doesn't mean just safe and structured play with grown-ups hovering around and managing it. You gotta be quick, Tom. You can't miss your bingo. It also means risky play, play with little to no supervision, where kids are able to learn their limits together. In 2014, for Psychology Today, Dr. Peter Gray wrote a piece titled "Risky Play: Why Children Love It and Need It." And in that he writes, from an evolutionary perspective, the obvious question about risky play is this: why does it exist? It can cause injury and even death, so why hasn't natural selection weeded it out? The fact that it hasn't been weeded out is evidence that the benefits must outweigh the risk. Researchers have devised ways to deprive young rats of play during a critical phase of their development without depriving them of other social experience. He continues, rats raised in this way grow up emotionally stunted. When placed in a novel environment, they overact with fear and fail to adapt and explore as a normal rat would. When placed with an unfamiliar peer, they may alternate between freezing in fear and lashing out with inappropriate, ineffective aggression. Such findings have contributed to the emotion regulation theory of play. The theory that one of play's major functions is to teach young mammals how to regulate fear and anger. In risk play, young rats dose themselves with manageable quantities of fear and practice keeping their heads and behaving adaptively while experiencing that fear. They learn that they can manage their fear, overcome it, and come out alive. This risky play operates alongside all other kinds of play, the semi-directed in a school setting, as supporting the discovery method of teaching or as supporting the inquiry method. Risky play exists alongside things like family game night or Halloween parties at your congregation. There's imaginative play and artistic play, so many different ways that we are built for and long for play. The article goes on to articulate the dangers of limiting or preventing play, especially risky play, among children. Gray cites other studies that show that children limited in these ways are more likely to display and develop psychopathologies, neuroticism, sorry, I had to get that word out, and anxiety. Gray's work notes that over the past 60 to 70 years, we have limited more and more children's ability to experience independent, free play. Helicopter parenting, laws that prevent children from having independence because we can't send them out alone or leave them home alone. And outside of laws, the social pressure that expects both parents and kids to behave in certain ways. All of these have conspired to make it harder and harder to allow children the freedom to play. And all of this has made it harder, I think, to engage in play as adults. I think there's another culprit, and I would put that as the fear-mongering style of our 24-hour news cycle. The same thing that contributes to our anxiety as adults, being constantly aware of the horrible things that can happen in the world and do. I think it's deeply impacted child growth and how we treat parenting. Parents have been encouraged to imagine that strangers will pop out of the blue and kidnap their children or harm them. I have spoken to folks who say they literally can't imagine bringing a child into the world. I get that. My response to that has always been that each of us is called to live in our unique ways, and they certainly do not have to have children if that's not what they are called to. For my part, I viewed raising children as an act of resistance and hope in this world that we share, as a way for me to almost externalize my deep belief in the power of people to change the world. But that's not for everybody, right? And I get it. And even folks like me who are like, hope, we can do it. Even folks like me are prodded to a level of anxiety about if we are parenting well enough, if we're doing the right things, if the children will be okay, if the world is gonna harm them, and so on. And this is part of what our world is right now. Anxiety, filled with fear that we don't know how to manage. We're wound pretty tight, folks. How many of us are able to cut loose enough to put on a costume at Halloween Anyone? Okay, great. Maybe you're not wound as tight as I am. How many of us enjoy a board game like just for the fun of it, not because you have to win, but just like for fun? Some of us, okay. How many of us make up stories and tell them to our friends or the little people in our lives, the children? Some of us, great. How many of us draw or paint with abandon, not worrying about if it's gonna look perfect or pretty? Some of us. How many of us do what we would call imaginative play anymore? Like pretend that you're like an animal running through the forest. Some of us, okay? Yeah, some of us. But these are skills that often fade as we grow. Our anxiety grows, our capacity to hold ourselves in and hold ourselves back grows as we attempt to avoid anything that feels like criticism or anything that feels like shame that we're not good enough or perfect enough. I will tell you that earlier this year, Guy, my husband, his office had a work party in the summer, and for reasons I'll allow him to explain at coffee hour, there's karaoke at every work party, and I have never done karaoke in my life because I am way too terrified. I know, right? That has always been my response. It requires a level of unself-consciousness that I have not possessed probably since I was in 3rd grade. And I did it. I did karaoke at the work party. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. I don't know why, right? I don't know why that was like the moment that I was like, oh, I can do this now. But it was like super liberating, you guys. I have to say that. To let go of worrying about what folks would say and do something just for the pleasure of it, right? Just for the fun of it. To be able to play, because that's kind of what it is. It's just play. An intentional cultivation of the capacity to let go, to be unfettered for a time, in safe ways, is part of engaging in play. And I actually think that engaging in play can be an antidote to what ails us. Our reading this morning, that gray article, Progressive Models of Education, they teach us that play is vital for creating resilience, for developing the capacity for relationships, especially across differences, and for reducing anxiety. And I have come to believe that we are called as much to play as anything else. Play is that which helps us to understand and internalize our experiences of the world around us. Play as that which allows us to smile in spite of the state of the world. Play as that which trains us in being with others and negotiating relationships and boundaries. Play is that which brings us closer to each other and closer to that deep part of us that simply wants to laugh and love and enjoy these lives of ours. Play as that which can save us.